Hey guys, what is up? And welcome back to another episode of Real Talk about the Bible, in which we talk about this weird and wonderful book that we call the Bible. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a question that I hear a lot, and it's, hey, I've never read the Bible, I'm reading the Bible for the first time, or I'm getting back to reading the Bible. Where should I start? And if you're completely unfamiliar with the Bible, you might think, well, that's a really dumb question. You start at the beginning and you just read to the end. It's a book. But the thing is, the Bible actually isn't really a book in the traditional sense. It's actually a library of 66 books divided into two major halves in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament being the Hebrew scriptures that tell the story of God's people, the Israelites, and how they break trust with God and how God relentlessly pursues them despite their disobedience. And it doesn't really have an ending until you get to the New Testament, in which Jesus comes on the scene and this story is continued, and Jesus carries forth that story into a new era and starts what we call the Christian movement, which really started as a Jewish movement. And so within these 66 books, it's fair to ask, where should I start? Because you're really asking, well, what book should I start with? There's a whole lot of options. And my recommendation to you might seem a little strange. I would actually recommend that you start 2/3, if not even more, of the way through and start in what is called the Gospels. And you see, the Bible has tons of different genres of books in it, from wisdom literature to narrative to prophecy to poetry to letters to apocalypse, and then these books called the Gospels, which tell the story of the good news about Jesus. And this is where I would start, because the Christian faith, it's really centered around this figure that we believe wasn't just a man, but was in fact God. And his name is Jesus. And the best place to start then would be to start with his story. But maybe even before you do that, I would try to gain just a basic understanding of the story of the Old Testament, because it's so important to remember that the Christian movement didn't start as just some brand new thing, but really was a continuation of the Jewish movement and morphing it into something that was radically different, but yet still had its roots in Judaism. It started as a Jewish messianic movement, and so to really understand what Jesus had to say, it helps to understand the Jewish worldview and what they would have thought. But if you do that by reading the entire Old Testament, you're probably going to quit at some point, because that's like almost 1,000 pages of just dense material that's going to be really hard to understand, and you're going to struggle through it. So I would suggest starting somewhere with like a Bible Project video. They have a great one called The Story of the Bible, or What is the Story of the Bible, where in 5 minutes you can just get this broad overview of what's happening in the Bible. And once you understand that, you'll be better equipped to jump into the Gospels. And if I had to pick and I was starting in the Gospels, I would start in John. But there's really no wrong choice there. There's 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 3 of them called the Synoptic Gospels because they're very similar, being Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then John's is a little different, just a little more theologically minded, and I really enjoy it. So that's where I personally would start. And then after you've read the book of John, I'd maybe go back to Genesis and Exodus, which are the first 2 books in the Old Testament. And those will just give you like the foundational story of the Israelites. And you'll see all throughout the New Testament, we're referencing back to the Old Testament stories, and they're mapping these ideas onto these common stories that everyone would have been familiar with. So once you've done that and you've read John and then maybe Genesis and Exodus, then I'd probably hop back into the New Testament, maybe read some of Paul's letters, read the book of Acts, which tells the story of the early church. And then from there, really just keep expanding, experiment with different books, read them. The whole Bible is inspired, it's all God's word, and it's all great to read. And because of that, you'll sometimes hear people saying, well, you can't go wrong, start wherever you want. I guess, but like if you start in Leviticus, you're probably not going to get very far. Or if you start in the prophets, where they're just riffing off of Old Testament laws, you're probably just going to be confused. But it is true that the whole Bible is God's word, and it all has things to teach us, and it all plays a part in the story that the Bible tells. And before you start reading the Bible, it's helpful to just understand, well, what is the Bible? Because so many of us, we expect it to just be this book of rules of what to do and not to do and how to live our lives, and we just even think it's just basic instructions. And I've heard an acronym that drives me crazy of basic instructions before leaving Earth, which if you go into reading the Bible that way, you're just really going to struggle with it, because, well, that's not what it is. It's a diverse story that communicates in different mediums, in different ways, and it tells just this unfolding drama of God's redemptive plan for humanity. But it does it in diverse ways that don't just look like rule books of how to live. And so before you enter into the Bible, just recognize that maybe what you thought the Bible isn't exactly what it is, and let the Bible speak for itself rather than implanting your own ideas onto it. So those are my quick thoughts on where to start if you have never read the Bible, or you just want to get back to reading the Bible or jump into it for the first time. It is a wonderful book. Like I said in the first video on this series, it can be hard to understand, and if you don't understand it, that's okay. Maybe put a question mark next to it and come back to it. Maybe later you'll understand it better. And use resources as you go. If you need some tips on that, watch the first video. I talked a little more in depth about how to read the Bible and ways that will help you understand it. But I hope that you jump into this book, because I really do believe that it still transforms lives and is a book that is unlike any other book. So if you enjoyed this video, click like, give me a comment, give me a thumbs up on it, let me know what you think, and of course, if you want to see more of this content, make sure to hit subscribe. I am so glad you guys watched this, and I will see you next time.